Thanks, Linda Jean. I did read the end of chapter 14, but for some reason I didn't put it on. And just now I'm having a problem with having enough memory to record, so I hope I can do this. Reading it again. Passing through the birch grove one day, he came up on several of the boys who were amusing themselves by climbing up the trees and swinging down again as the slender elastic stems bent till their tops touched the ground. Dan paused a minute to watch the fun without offering to join in it, and as he stood there, Jack took his turn. He had unfortunately chosen too large a tree, for when he swung off it, it only bent a little way and left him hanging at a dangerous height. "Go back, you can't do it," called Ned from below. Jack tried, but the twigs slipped from his hands and he could not get his legs around the trunk. He kicked and squirmed and clutched in vain, then gave up and hung breathless, saying helplessly, "Catch me, help me, I must drop." "You'll be killed if you do," cried Ned, frightened out of his wits. "Hold on," shouted Dan, and up the tree he went, crashing his way along till he nearly reached Jack, whose face looked up at him, full of fear and hope. "You'll both come down," said Ned, dancing with excitement on the slope underneath, while Nat held out his arms in the wild hope of breaking the fall. "That's what I want. Stand from under," answered Dan coolly, and as he spoke, his added weight bent the tree many feet nearer the earth. Jack dropped safely, but the birch, lightened of half its load, flew up again so suddenly that Dan, in the act of swinging round to drop feet foremost, lost his hold and fell heavily. "I'm not hurt. All right in a minute," he said, sitting up a little pale and dizzy, as the boys gathered round him full of admiration and alarm. "You're a trump, Dan, and I'm ever so much obliged to you," cried Jack gratefully. "It wasn't anything," muttered Dan, rising slowly. "I say it was, and I'll shake hands with you, though you are—" Ned checked the unlucky word on his tongue and held out his hand, feeling that it was a handsome thing on his part. "But I won't shake hands with a sneak," and Dan turned his back with a look of scorn that caused Ned to remember the brook and retire with undignified haste. "Come home, old chap, I'll give you a lift," and Nat walked away with them, leaving the others to talk over the feat together, to wonder when Dan would come round, and to wish one and all that Tommy's confounded money had been in Jericho before it made such a fuss. When Mr. Bear came into school next morning, he looked so happy that the boys wondered what had happened to him, and really thought he had lost his mind when they saw him go straight to Dan and taking him by both hands, say all in one breath, as he shook them heartily, "I know all about it, and I beg your pardon. It was like you to do it, and I love you for it, though it's never right to tell lies, even for a friend." "What is it?" cried Nat, for Dan said not a word, only lifted up his head as if a weight of some sort had fallen off his back. "Dan didn't take Tommy's money," said Mr. Bear, and Mr. Bear quite shouted it, he was so glad. "Who did?" cried the boys in a chorus. Mr. Bear pointed to one empty seat, and every eye followed his finger, yet no one spoke for a minute, they were so surprised. "Jack went home early this morning, but he left this behind," and in the silence Mr. Bear read the note which he had found tied to his door handle when he arose. "I took Tommy's dollar. I was peeking in through a crack and saw him put it in there. I was so afraid to tell before, though I wanted to. I didn't care so much about Nat, but Dan is a trump, and I can't stand it any longer. I never spent the money. It's under the carpet in my room, right behind the washstand. I'm awful sorry. I'm going home and don't think I shall ever come back, so Dan may have my things. Jack." It was not an elegant confession, being badly written, much blotted and very short, but it was a precious paper to Dan. And when Mr. Bear paused, the boy went to him, saying in a rather broken voice, but with clear eyes, in the frank, respectful manner they tried to teach him. "I'll say I'm sorry now and ask you to forgive me, sir." "It was a kind lie, Dan, and I can't help forgiving you, but you see it did no good." And Mr. Bear, with a hand on either shoulder and a face full of relief and affection. "It kept the boys from plaguing Nat. That's what I did it for. It made him downright miserable. I didn't care so much," explained Dan, as if glad to speak out after his hard silence. "How could you do it? You're always so kind to me," faltered Nat, feeling a strong desire to hug his friend and cry, two girlish performances which would have scandalized Dan to the last degree. "It's all right now, old fella, so don't be a fool," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat and laughing out as he had not done for weeks. "Does Mr. Bear know?" he asked eagerly. Excuse me. "Yes, and she is so happy. I don't know what she will do to you," began Mr. Bear, but got no farther, for here the boys came crowding around Dan in a tumult of pleasure and curiosity. But before he had answered more than a dozen questions, a voice cried out, "3 cheers for Dan!" And there was Mrs. Joe in the doorway, waving her dish towel and looking as if she wanted to dance a jig for joy as she used to do when a girl. "Now then," cried Mr. Bear, and let off a rousing hurrah which startled Asia in the kitchen and made old Mr. Roberts shake his head as he drove by, saying, "Schools are not what they were when I was young." Dan stood it pretty well for a minute, but the sight of Mrs. Joe's delight upset him, and he suddenly bolted across the hall into the parlor, whither she instantly followed, and neither were seen for half an hour. Mr. Bear found it very difficult to calm his excited flock, and seeing that lessons were an impossibility for a time, he caught their attention by telling them the fine old story of the friends whose fidelity to one another has made their names immortal. The lads listened and remembered, for just then their hearts were touched by the loyalty of a humbler pair of friends. The lie was wrong, but the love that prompted it and the courage that bore in silence the disgrace which belonged to another made Dan a hero in their eyes. Honesty and honor had a new meaning now. A good name was more precious than gold, for once lost, money could not buy it back. And faith in one another made life smooth and happy as nothing else could do. Tommy proudly restored the name of the firm. Nat was devoted to Dan, and all the boys tried to atone to both for former suspicion and neglect. Mrs. Joe rejoiced over her flock, and Mr. Bear was never tired of telling the story of his young Damon and Pythias, which was the name of chapter 14. Now we're done. Thank you, Linda Jean. Love you guys. Bye.